Welcome to everyone joining us for this legislative briefing on institutional debt. My name is Samantha Sang, and I'm the Legislative Director and Policy Advisor for NextGen California. We're happy to be co-hosting today's event with the author of AB 1160, Assemblymember Blanca Pacheco, our fellow bill co-sponsors, along with the Campaign for California Borrowers' Rights Coalition. The Campaign for California Borrowers' Rights Coalition is a statewide diverse coalition of students, higher education advocates, consumer and borrower protection organizations focused on the issue of student debt. Today, we'll be discussing a lesser known type of education-related debt called institutional debt, what California is doing about this issue through solutions in AB 1160, the Protecting Students from Creditor Colleges Act, and the latest research on the impact of the bill. I'm happy to introduce Assemblymember Blanca Pacheco. She was elected to the California State Assembly in November of 2022 to represent the 64th Assembly District. Assemblymember Pacheco was elected to serve the Downey City Council in 2016 and served 2 terms as mayor in 2020 and 2022. She previously served as president of the League of California Cities Los Angeles Division and was the first elected official from Downey to serve in this position. The Assemblymember is a former chair of the Housing, Community, and Economic Development Policy Committee and served on the League of California Cities State Board as an at-large director. Assemblymember Pacheco is the daughter of a nurse and public school bus driver and grew up in a working-class community. She graduated from UCLA, receiving her bachelor's degree in political science and a specialization in Chicano studies. She went on to Loyola Law School and has been a practicing attorney since 2003. We're very happy to have her today with us as the author for AB 1160, a bill that, if passed, will again place California leading the nation on protecting students with any education-related debt. Assemblymember Pacheco, please take it away.
Thank you, and thank you for the introduction. I want to welcome everyone and wish everybody a happy new year. I want to thank all of you for taking time out of your busy schedules to attend this briefing. As you are all aware, much has been done about federal student loans. However, you may not be aware that currently across California, more than 3.9 million borrowers owe nearly 148 million in student loan debt, and institutional debts have ballooned, affecting more than 750,000 low-income students. AB 1160 aims to protect students from the most harmful impacts of institutional debt and provide much-needed transparency on the growth and implications of this debt across our state. We are here today to shed light on this unexpected barrier to students and the solutions I'm working on to address this problem in California in Assembly Bill 1160. So we have several speakers. Our first speaker will be Aisa Canchola Baines from the Student Borrower Protection Center and a co-sponsor of AB 1160 to help define institutional debt and what they've seen on this issue across the nation.
Thank you so much, Member Pacheco. Good afternoon, everyone. Again, my name is Aisa Canchola Bañez. I am a Senior Advisor for Policy and Strategy with the Student Borrower Protection Center. It is a privilege to be with y'all today, and I'm very grateful that you've joined us to really learn about this crisis that's taking place not only in California but across the country. So, as the Congresswoman or as the Assembly members mentioned, the institutional debt crisis is not new. And while it was most certainly exacerbated by the pandemic, it has been a longstanding and unfortunately overlooked issue for quite a while. And again, it does have national implications. So what is institutional debt? So institutional debts are debts owed by a current or former student and directly to their institution of higher education. These kind of shadow student debts, as we call them, include anything from fines for overdue library books, parking fees, to a balance of tuition following a mid-semester withdrawal. The majority of this debt is incurred when students with federal financial aid, think a Pell Grant or a student loan, have to unexpectedly withdraw before the end of a term. This is one of the reasons why this debt was so exacerbated over the course of the pandemic, because we saw mass waves of students having to withdraw due to economic hardship, due to caregiving responsibilities or for health reasons. So as a result, schools are required to return a portion of their financial aid money to the Department of Education. Schools then choose, in order to recoup these funds, to charge the student for the amount of the returned financial aid, converting what could have been a Pell Grant into a debt owed directly to the school and oftentimes due immediately. And institutional debt can have massive educational and economic consequences for students. Schools resort to extremely punitive collection practices in order to recoup these funds. Based on research conducted by our very own academic partners, one of which the experts is on this briefing today, research has shown that students have been subject to administrative holds on their accounts, preventing them from enrolling or re-enrolling in coursework. They've had transcripts, degrees, certificates withheld, preventing them from being able to get a job or sit for licensing exams, jobs and things necessary to actually get a job to help them get to a place financially where they could actually repay that debt. Students have also, have also been placed in private collections, which can harm their credit score, impacting their ability to get a job, secure housing, and students have even been subject to tax benefit offsets in order to collect. So institutional debts, really impact a student's educational trajectory, oftentimes stopping a student from advancing right there in their tracks, and has impacts on their broader economic lives over the long term. Bullet there, unlike traditional student loan debts, which are owed directly to the federal government or to a private bank, there's also a scary lack of transparency and consumer protections around institutional debt. That shadow student debt that we refer to, and really shows that it's a very growing and concerning aspect or growing market across the nation. Next slide, please. So what does this look like, across the nation? So as of 2020, which is the most recent data available, there was nearly $15 billion in outstanding institutional debt across the country. In response to, as part of, the federal COVID response efforts, Congress allocated $20 billion to support institutions of higher education across the country, in response to the pandemic. And these funds, including funds that could address institutional debt. As a result, we saw over 20 historically Black colleges and universities, or HBCUs, across the country cancel outright, essentially clearing slates for students and allowing them to re-enroll and advance towards their degree. Right here in California, we saw institutions like Compton Community College and San Francisco City College canceling institutional debts so that students can get back on track. Sacramento State also had created kind of a program to allow students to apply for relief. And more recently, the Biden administration announced what's known as a negotiated rulemaking process. It's an administrative process that informs new rules and regulations out of the Department of Education. And this new process is going to address the policy that oftentimes leaves students with institutional debt. It's called the Return to Title IV process. And so, one of the proposed changes that the Department of Education is offering to make for consideration is to streamline at the federal level in order to incentivize schools to no longer collect institutional debts from students that derive from this kind of return of federal aid process back to the federal government. Now, this is not final and is subject to a longer-term negotiated rulemaking discussion and process, but it is signal that federal policymakers acknowledge the harms of institutional debt and see, that maybe the status quo with schools collecting from students so rigorously really isn't the best solution for students. And in the meantime, states, have been making progress addressing the harms of institutional debt. So California was the first state to prohibit transcript withholding as a means to collect on institutional debt with passage of AB 1313. And as a result, several states have followed suit. Additionally, on the budget front, California allocated $650 million through the Learning Recovery Emergency Block Grant, as well as $150 million for student retention and enrollment, specifically to help community colleges. And these funds offer a ton of flexibility, but one of the uses of funds could be used to cancel institutional debts. And then the state of Virginia became the first to really kind of require robust data reporting on the prevalence of institutional debt, as well as the impact of institutional debt. So, we are seeing a lot of action happening at the federal level through Congress and the administration, as well as here in California and other states, which is evidence that, there's a lot of momentum to address the institutional debt crisis, and is why we're so grateful to have a partner with the partner Assemblywoman Pacheco for really introducing AB 1160 and will position California to continue to be a leader on addressing this issue as well. So with that, I'm happy to turn it back to you, Assemblywoman.
Perfect. Thank you so very much, Aisa. We will now hand it over to Professor Jimenez from UC Irvine School of Law, and also one of the co-authors of the latest policy brief on institutional debt.
Thanks so much, Assembly Member. I'm really happy to be here. Everyone, my name is Dalia Jimenez, and I'm a law professor at UC Irvine, where I co-direct the Student Loan Law Initiative, which is an academic research center centered on all aspects of student debt. And I'm here to tell you about the most recent thing is the 2023 policy brief, just last month that we published with, and the we is myself and professors from UC Merced and UC Berkeley. And then it all started back in 2022 in March when we published our report on the issue of institutional debt, gathering data from the three segments, the public segments, and about, what kind of institutional debt had grown during COVID. And so we first documented this debt, this problem as, one that, as Aisa said, has been around for a long time. Every time I talk to someone about this problem, people talk about how they had to pay a bill before they could get their transcript or before they could graduate or walk, in graduation. It's basically every single person has such a story, myself included. But during the pandemic, as people had to leave for many excellent reasons, leave in the middle of a semester, these debts ballooned. And again, many of them incurred by low-income students as a result of what should have been a grant or was a grant originally. And we reported that 750,000 low-income students, we estimated, accumulated in the first 2 years of the pandemic, $350 million in institutional debts. When looking at essentially what happens to these debts, most schools end up trying to collect from the student. And in order to do so, they used to withhold transcripts. Now that's not allowed, although some websites still say something about this, that they might withhold the transcript. But what they really do most of the time is just prevent a student from re-enrolling. And some schools, not as much during the pandemic, but they're returning to it now, began to use third-party debt collectors, just irregular debt collectors that are used by credit card companies or anybody else. Debt collectors don't actually yield a lot of money for schools. They don't also disclose this very much, but we were able to get some data from a UC campus, and the numbers that we got over different years was between 17 and 19% of the debt that is placed with the debt collector is recovered. And that is before the fees that the debt collector charges. So ultimately, the school gets between 12 and 13% of whatever amount of debt, and that's how much they get from a debt collector. So not many schools do this, and some of them stopped during the pandemic. And the bill actually puts guardrails, as you'll hear later, around what kind of third-party debt collection can be used. But this 17 to 19%, let's say, is sort of the best case scenario, because I think as I mentioned, the data comes from a University of California campus, but nearly all other schools, the CSUs and the community colleges in particular, are actually enrolling greater numbers of economically disadvantaged students, so that the likelihood of collecting from them is even lower. Our data brief that is cited here is really focused on the impact, the economic impact that we estimate of AB 1160. And basically, if we can go to the next slide, actually. Here, I'm going to start, there's a lot of numbers. I'm going to start on the left-hand side with the numbers that we estimated based on data that we gathered from a number of community colleges, CSUs, and UCs of just the first 2 years of the pandemic. One big problem that the bill tries to address too is that there is actually not a lot of data. It is a very opaque system. Schools sometimes don't actually keep track of this data separately. But this is the best that we were able to gather, basically those first 3 columns about, the number of students that have incurred these debts in the first 2 years of the pandemic, the total incurred, and so the average per person, per student. Assuming a 20% collections rate, which is higher and does not include the cost of collection, we estimate that basically, $39 million would be collected by schools by placing these debts with third-party collectors. However, if schools are not, they can continue on to collect these debts through third party or by themselves. But if they do not place a enrollment hold, a re-enrollment hold on students, then they would be able to essentially, students would actually now be able to go back to school. And we have actually some data on how many students might actually go back to school if they are not prevented from returning by an enrollment hold from Lake Tahoe Community College, which right after in 2022 voluntarily canceled their institutional debts that were incurred during the pandemic using some federal HERF relief funds. So when they canceled those debts, they actually achieved a 33% re-enrollment rate for students. So we use that rate to estimate essentially the amount that schools could obtain from those students as they re-enroll and pay tuition and fees. We think that this enrollment rate, 33% estimate, should be attainable for each segment because the state has appropriated tens of millions of dollars in funding for re-enrollments in recent years. So ultimately, the conclusion of our data brief is that this is a revenue neutral and in fact likely positive, 195 in incurred debts and 214 in recovery, and that does not include any kind of actual collection. It's just a re-enrollment. So with that, I'll give it back to you, Assemblymember.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Jimenez, for that information. We are now going to hear from 2 student associations, also co-sponsors of AB 1160, the Cal State Student Association and UC Student Association, Dominique and Joanna.
Great, thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Dominic Quantressler. I am a student at San Jose State University, and I also serve as the president of the California State Student Association, which represents nearly 500,000 California State University students throughout the state. We are proud co-sponsors of AB 1160. Institutional debt is a major problem for students across all California higher education segments. As shown earlier, the Creditor College report by NextGen, the Student Borrower Protection Center, and UC researchers found that nearly 750,000 California students became indebted directly to California public colleges during the COVID-19 pandemic. This is a staggering number. Concurrently, since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, we have been facing an enrollment crisis. While the CSU's enrollment slightly increased this academic year, we're still not where we need to be. Institutional debt bars many people from returning to school and achieving their higher education dreams. It can also have serious long-term implications for a student's future, whether that be their future employment due to a diploma withholding or hurting their credit score, which takes years to rebuild. Many times, these debts can come up unexpectedly for students without ample time for them to correct the issue. We heard from one student at CSU Maritime Academy who told us that the night before registration, their financial aid changed unexpectedly, and they were alerted that there was suddenly a hold on the registration until the new balance was paid. In this instance, the student was able to pay the outstanding balance, but many are not as lucky. We have heard from numerous students, most recently at CSU East Bay, who are facing enrollment holds while trying to finish their last semester in college. After years of hard work and dedication, their dreams are suddenly out of reach. I also want to correct the record. Our bill doesn't allow students doesn't prevent students from paying their tuition. During my first semester at SJSU, I got dropped from all my classes due to a non-payment, but was able to re-enroll once I paid the outstanding balance. Unfortunately, all the classes I had selected were full, so I had to select ones. I bring this up because there had been concerns raised regarding students under this legislation essentially being free riders and being able to bypass tuition. This was never the intent of our bill, and the amendments we included make it clear that campuses will continue to implement drop for non-payment policies to ensure students pay tuition for a current semester or quarter. Our bill simply gives students with institutional debt the chance to re-enroll so they can keep making progress towards their degree while they work to repay an institutional debt from a previous term. This way, students are not being blocked from graduating and pursuing their dreams simply because of past institutional debt. Our bill will help students continue making progress in their higher education and help ensure schools can recoup necessary revenues. It is also important to note that institutional debt disproportionately affects low-income students, who are also more likely to belong to racially marginalized communities. At the CSU, nearly 1/3 of undergraduates are the first in their families to attend college, and nearly half of CSU students are from underrepresented communities. In addition, half of CSU undergraduates receive a Pell Grant, indicating financial need. The CSU prides itself as a leader in social mobility, with multiple campuses receiving national recognition from publications such as the US News and World Report and the Wall Street Journal. This critical mobility is hampered when institutional debt forces a student to drop out and not complete their degree. There is a major need for legislation like AB 1160 to ensure that students are not only able to enroll in our institutions, but also finish their degree. AB 1160 brings much needed transparency on institutional debt while also extending critical consumer protections for a large constituency in the future of California, our students. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Joanna Mendez. I'm a fourth year at UC Riverside, and I currently serve as the Government Relations Vice Chair for the UC Student Association, the official representative organization for 230,000 plus UC undergraduate students. UCSA is a proud co-sponsor of AB 1160. We believe in this bill's ability to protect students from harmful practices such as withholding degrees, transcripts, and stopping students from re-enrolling based merely on their institutional debt. The UC is also currently experiencing an enrollment crisis that is likely exacerbated by students unable to re-enroll or return to classes because of their institutional debt. We have seen these practices affect students in our very own organization. A student who served on our board last year and went to UC Davis purchased a $3 drink from one of the campus stores and forgot she charged it to her school account. Having forgotten this, the $3 debt caused her to be dropped from all her classes the next quarter, have her financial aid revoked, and her to have to reapply to financial aid and scramble for classes at the last minute after she had been dropped. This was because she owed $3. Although she was able to pay this debt, these debts are often much larger and can significantly impact students. We know that the majority of these debts accrue from students who may drop classes after they've received their financial aid and then are forced to pay back some or all of their financial aid. These students have often already spent these funds on necessities such as rent and food and have not budgeted to have to pay back their living expenses. This also makes clear that these debts are almost exclusively owed by low-income students who are also much more likely to belong to Black, Brown, Indigenous, or other underserved communities. UCSA is proud to co-sponsor and support this bill because students need the protections AB 1160 has to offer. Thank you. I'll pass it back to the Assembly member.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the students for providing their perspective on the bill and for your co-sponsorship of this important bill. I next want to have Winston Berkman Breen, also from the Student Borrower Protection Center, talk about solutions to institutional debt.
Thank you so much, Assembly Member, and thank you everyone for joining us here today. So as the Assembly Member just said, I'm going to talk through AB 1160, the bill itself, and how it addresses institutional debt. First, just because we've heard a lot of really important testimony, I'm going to spend sharing just 30 seconds sort of looping back what we've covered today, what my colleagues and other co-sponsors have covered today, which is institutional debt are debts owed to schools, which are sometimes the same as loans and sometimes distinct from loans, right? Your school can have a loan with you, but there's all sorts of other money that you might owe to your school. And when you have institutional debts, those can cause major barriers to retention, graduation, and employment. You can be barred from re-enrolling over a returned Pell Grant that you had to pay back to your school, over a $3 drink that you didn't know about, over a parking ticket that you didn't know about, health costs that were maybe incorrectly billed. And that can really create an academic bar against re-enrolling, but also stymie any progress that you might have made towards getting your degree and getting employed from that. Also, as our research partner, Professor Jimenez, pointed out, not only does this harm students, it's actually a little bit of a cutting off your nose to spite your face for the schools, right? So on the basis of a lower dollar, usually, debt that's owed, they prevent students from re-enrolling and bringing fresh tuition dollars with them. Federal financial aid can be used for your new tuition, but it can't necessarily be used for your past debts, right? So they may be foregoing $4,000 or $5,000 or $6,000 of new tuition revenue in order to collect on $100 or $200, $300 of debts that are owed. And as Professor Jimenez pointed out, the collection tactics that these schools are using are not particularly effective, which is to say they are not actually recouping the money that is owed, but again, are standing as a barrier to student success, but also to new revenue for the school. So I know that was a little bit high level and rushed based on the 4 or 5 people you just heard from, but to sort of reset the status quo. And how does AB 1160 address all of that? So first, on this slide, I'm just going to talk through what the bill actually does. And then on the second slide, which we'll get to in a few minutes, I'm going to go over what it doesn't do, to just be very clear about both of those things. So first and foremost, what the bill would do is prevent schools from barring someone from re-enrolling or registering for classes based on a past institutional debt, right? Just because a semester or two ago you had to drop out and maybe you owe your school $600 that you can't pay out of pocket, that shouldn't be the reason you can't re-enroll, get your degree, get a job, and repay that debt. So it makes sure that that isn't a barrier to re-enrollment, retention, and graduation. It also prevents schools from, like the current law, AB 1313, that says schools can't withhold transcripts, which happened in 2019. It says that if a student has satisfied their academic requirements for a degree, the school can't withhold the degree, right? Again, it's the same principle. Let's not let a lower dollar sum that is completely stopping a student in their tracks and keeping them in limbo prevent them from getting to a place where they're economically stable and can turn around and repay that debt to the school. In terms of the debt collection that you heard Professor Jimenez talk about, the bill would ensure that when schools use third-party debt collectors, which again is not particularly effective, but they do use them, it ensures that there are some consumer protections and guardrails. For instance, it says that schools have to create and publish a policy about that is consistent with consumer protection law in California about how they collect on these debts, and that when they work with a third-party debt collector, that collector has to be licensed with the state of California, which is already the law, and has to also subscribe to that policy that the school has adopted. Further, the school has to wait, this is the proposed language in the bill, has to wait 180 days before they can assign a debt to a third-party debt collector. And when they do that, they have to send a notice to the student letting them know that their debt has been assigned, the company that's being assigned to, so that if the student gets outreach, they know this isn't a fraudulent company, and what they can do to go about repaying that debt. So again, sort of common sense consumer protections and transparency measures to make sure that if someone is going to work with a third-party debt collector, that's not going to be abusive for the student, and the student is best positioned to repay that debt. And then also related to debt collection, my colleague Aisa mentioned that through the FTB's interagency intercept collection program, state-owed debts, so for the public's, state-owed debts can be recouped by offsetting public benefits and tax refunds through the IIC. So this bill would eliminate that mechanism so that someone's public benefits, quite literally, aren't being offset so that they can repay some educational debt, while again being prohibited from re-enrolling. And then finally, as Professor Jimenez made the point, there's very little data about this, multi-million billion-dollar debt market in California that is real debt, right? People can get sued. They do get sued over this. It has real effects on people's lives, but it's not treated the same way that other debt markets are. And so as a result, doesn't have the same reporting requirements to state agencies. So the bill 1160 would put in place sort of common sense reporting on, as drafted, on the public segment, typical in the financial services, consumer protection, debt regulation space. So that's a summary of what the bill does. If we want to go to the next slide, I'll just clarify what the bill doesn't do. So first and foremost, it does not cancel any debt, right? This is not a debt cancellation bill. That's a completely other conversation that we should hopefully at some point have. But all this does is make sure that this debt isn't unduly punitive in terms of how it's collected relative to students. So it does not cancel any debt. It also doesn't require or doesn't permit a student to get a degree without ever paying. It doesn't even require schools to admit someone for a term without paying. Schools already have so-called drop for non-payment policies. We heard one of our student speakers, Dom, talk about that experience. Basically what it says is if you haven't paid your tuition or entered a payment arrangement within usually 2 to 3 weeks of the term starting, you will be dropped for non-payment. The bill explicitly allows schools to maintain that policy. The bill is not about allowing non-payment into the future. It's just about making sure past debts that have accrued aren't a barrier for students returning to school and graduating, right? So if someone has $600 from 1 or 2 semesters ago and wants to re-enroll for the spring or summer term, they still have to pay that spring or summer tuition. And if they do, they can re-enroll despite having a balance carried over from before. The bill also does not prevent schools from expelling students or preventing re-enrollment on other bases, right? This is just about institutional debt. So if there's an honor code violation or some other, or they fail out or something along those lines, students can still be not be readmitted or be expelled. This is just about making those decisions on the basis of an existence of a debt, right? And then finally, the bill does not prohibit the use of third-party debt collectors. Schools can continue to use third-party debt collectors. We mentioned the guardrails that we put in place, but it does not ban the use of third-party debt collectors. I do want to pause here and say that the last slide and this slide, the way we're talking about the bill today is in terms of the most recent amendments that are being negotiated with all the stakeholders and will be discussed in the bill hearing next week on Tuesday, I believe. And so doesn't necessarily match the legislative text that is online and filed if you were to go look, but will soon be amended and in the bill hearing will be adopted. So one example of that is the original bill did prohibit the use of third-party debt collectors by schools. And in talking with the schools and third-party debt collectors, the author and the sponsors, we've all come to an agreement through negotiations about allowing that practice with the consumer protections and guardrails we discussed. So the language as we're discussing it here and what it would do reflects the latest bill in concept, which will be adopted next week. All right, so with that, I'm going to hand it back over to the Assembly member, and thank you all again.
And thank you very much, Winston. And yes, this bill will be heard next Tuesday. But we do have one more speaker before we do our Q&A. Our last speaker is Sarah from Young Invincibles, who are also co-sponsors of AB 1160. And she will talk about next steps for the bill.
Thank you so much, Assembly Member. Hi, everyone. As Assemblywoman mentioned, my name is Sara, and I represent Young Invincibles, and we are one of the co-sponsors on the bill. You've heard from many of the co-sponsors today, but we just wanted to elevate and mention them by name once again. So we really thank the UC Student Association and California State Student Association for their leadership on this, representing student needs throughout the entire systems. And as has been mentioned by my fellow co-sponsors, this bill is a priority bill for the Campaign for California Borrowers' Rights Coalitions. And the members mentioned here on screen, Student Borrower Protection Center, Student Debt Crisis Center, NextGen California, Consumer Reports, and Young Invincibles are also steering members of the California Borrowers' Rights Coalitions and co-sponsors on this bill. Go to the next slide. So what are the next steps for AB 1160? So AB 1160 is currently a 2-year bill. It is now in the Assembly Higher Education Committee. We will be there on Tuesday, January 9th, at the Higher Ed Committee hearing. And in addition to that, we will need to pass the Appropriations Committee and the floor session by the end of January in order to meet the 2-year bill deadline. And so some of the next steps for us and some calls to action is for any legislative staff on the call, we really ask that you urge your members to support this measure. This bill is really important in protecting students and really helping California kind of set the way for the rest of the nation and protect millions of students across the country as well as in the state. And for anyone on the call who is able to support, in general, we really need as much support as we can in the Assembly Higher Education Committee to pass AB 1160. So if you're able to join the hearing next week, please do come and voice your support for the bill. And with that, I will turn it back over.
Thank you very much. So now we've reached the Q&A portion of our webinar. So if you have any questions, please type them at the bottom of your screens. And I see we have already 2 questions. The first one is there any reason re-enrolled students wouldn't receive state or federal financial aid to pay tuition and fees at their institution of higher education once they re-enroll?
Great. So currently, federal financial aid and federal financial aid is available to students to cover their current semester. So if a student is enrolling, beginning classes, in a few weeks, the financial aid package that they receive from their school, from the federal government, is intended to pay for only the tuition and fees associated with the current term. So institutional debt, essentially being kind of these lingering debts from past semesters, would not be able to be covered by financial aid. And so that's one of the reasons why we see students kind of for much smaller amounts, not being able to cover those costs out of pocket, and as a result, unable to advance and bring in additional tuition revenues to their institution. That's a great question.
But if I can just add, actually, just in case the question was slightly different, that there isn't a reason why students, the federal government does not have any policy on, not allowing you to get financial aid, based on you owing a debt to your institution. There isn't anything like that. So if a student was eligible for financial aid, they would be eligible, regardless of their past debt.
Thank you. That was a really good question. Here is the next question. In regards to the story Joanna shared about another UC student who had a $3 drink turn into an institutional debt, are students alerted in any way, or is it reflected in their account portal about these kinds of costs or charges?
I think I can take that one because I think our students might have had to jump off. It varies. Obviously, schools have different systems, and it sounds kind of crazy that a $3 debt would trigger all of these draconian measures, like dropping a student out. But we have heard this again and again, because oftentimes it seems that schools have just automated systems, and while maybe it is in some online portal that the student may be able to log in, how quickly it goes on that portal, whether the student receives an email or some other alert, that we have not heard, as often. So it is very much the case that, in any rational system, this $3 bill, regardless of AB 1160, right, the $3 charge should not trigger all these draconian measures. There should be some de minimis amount that, the student is going to figure that out as soon as they find out about it, of course. But what we have heard again and again is that the schools, their systems, for whatever reason, do not distinguish. And so while there may be some way in which a student could find out, there is often no advance notice where a student would obviously have paid the $3 rather than be dropped from their classes, unfortunately.
Thank you. And we have one final question, which is a common question that we have been receiving. And the question is the institutional debt the same as student loan debt?
I mean,
Great.
yeah, so it is debts that a student incurs. So in some ways, you know, it's a category of like a debt that a student owes, a former or current student owes. But it is not the same in the sense that when we think of student debt, we're thinking primarily of federal student debt, which has a lot of protections for the borrower in terms of income-driven repayment, public service loan forgiveness, you know, forgiveness for death, all sorts of protections, which this does not. And that debt, student debt, as we normally think of it, is due over a very long period of time, which can be extended. This debt owed to the school, the institution, is debt that is often due immediately. And then schools may enter into a payment plan with the student, like, you know, if it's if it's a Pell Grant, you know, several thousands of dollars, the student would not have the money to pay for that. They needed a Pell Grant. So then they may enter into a payment plan or something like that, but it is not anything like the type of stuff that's available to federal student borrowers.
Much, Dr. Jimenez, for answering that question. This last question, there is one more question, and the question is, what would you tell, what would you tell your fellow lawmakers if you were telling them how important this bill is and why it deserves their support? So I'll go ahead and answer this last question. So I would tell my fellow legislators and lawmakers that this is an important debt because we're helping students. Students shouldn't have barriers to receive their education. And I've had a passion for helping students and helping our younger generation to succeed in life. And this is just a tool to help them succeed in life. My passion is helping them. And so we deserve to help them so that way they can be our future leaders. And so I will be having many discussions with my fellow legislators, and I'm looking forward to having this bill pass and get signed by the governor. But I'm going to go ahead and conclude our webinar. I just want to thank you all for this opportunity to have this important discussion. I want to remind you all that AB 1160 will be heard in higher ed next Tuesday on the 9th, and it will be heard at 1:30 p.m. I want to wish all of you a wonderful day and a wonderful weekend, and thank you again for your time.